Racist cop burn elderly man's face, unaware his son is brutal chief of Navy SEAL. In a dusty corner of a southern town where time seemed to drag its feet and the air always carried the faint scent of old wood and dry earth, lived Abraham Cole, a 70-year-old retired electrician with hands calloused from decades of quiet labor and a heart made softer by loss. His home sat just off a long stretch of cracked two-lane road, nestled beneath a pair of towering oaks that creaked when the wind passed through their limbs. The house itself was modest, white siding faded by sun, its roof patched by Abraham's own steady hands, and the front porch slightly crooked with age. But it stood proud, much like the man who kept it alive. Abraham began each day the same way. Just after the sun broke over the horizon and the birds resumed their unhurried morning conversations, he would step outside in worn boots and a denim shirt, sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He carried an old metal watering can, dented from years of use, and made his way to the edge of his yard, where a narrow strip of soil held a simple garden. There, in neat rows, bloomed daisies, marigolds, and a single red rose bush he'd planted nearly 10 years ago, on what would have been his late wife Helen's 60th birthday. Every flower had a place. Every weed was pulled by hand. He believed the act of tending to beauty was a form of quiet prayer, and in this daily ritual, he found peace. The neighbors often watched from behind their windows or across the street with a kind of detached curiosity. They knew Abraham in the way that small towns knew everyone, by name, by routine, by old stories whispered in diners. But few truly knew him. They offered nods or polite greetings as they passed, but rarely stopped for anything more. Some said it was because Abraham kept to himself, but deep down, even the more honest townsfolk understood it was something else, something older. Abraham's skin was a shade darker than most in town, and in a place that hadn't fully released its grip on old resentments and quiet prejudices, that difference was enough to place an invisible wall around him, yet Abraham held no bitterness. He had long ago learned the power of patience and the strength of silence. His dignity didn't come from how others saw him, but from how he carried himself when no one was looking. He fixed things for neighbors who didn't always say thank you, mowed his lawn with quiet precision, and attended town meetings where his suggestions were often ignored but always calmly given. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard, though few had ever truly listened. Inside his home the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and linseed oil. Tools hung neatly in the small garage, where Abraham sometimes tinkered with broken radios or rewired old lamps for fun. Photos lined the hallway walls, faded memories of a life well lived. One picture, more recent than the others, showed a young man in uniform, sharp-eyed and broad-shouldered, standing beside an American flag. Abraham kept it near the kitchen table, where he sat each evening with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he only half read. What the townsfolk didn't see, and perhaps never cared to ask about, was that Abraham had a son. Commander Elias Cole, decorated Navy SEAL, known among his peers for his unwavering discipline and tactical brilliance. Elias had spent years abroad, serving in places most Americans only saw in headlines: harsh deserts, dense jungles, far-off coastlines where danger lurked in shadow and silence. He'd led missions that were never reported, carried burdens few could imagine, and returned each time with one thought that grew louder in his mind: home. Their relationship hadn't always been easy. After Helen's death, a quiet rift had formed between father and son, stretched by oceans and unspoken grief. They had gone months without talking, sometimes even years. But something had shifted over time. Perhaps it was age, or the growing understanding of mortality, or maybe it was just the way memory softened anger. They began writing letters, real ones on paper, where Elias would recount brief moments of his deployments and Abraham would reply with stories about the old house or the garden. Phone calls followed, short and infrequent, but warmer each time. There was laughter now and apologies that didn't need to be spoken out loud. In those small exchanges, the wound began to heal. Elias had promised to return soon, not just for a visit, but to stay a while. He said the operations were slowing down, that he had enough leave built up to spend a real stretch at home. Abraham, always modest, tried not to show how much it meant to him. But every morning, when he stood in the garden with the sun on his back, he would glance at the porch steps, and imagine his son sitting there with a cup of tea, watching the roses bloom. The days ticked by in quiet preparation. Abraham repaired the guest room, changed the sheets, dusted the furniture with unusual care. He even fixed the squeaky step at the back door, a project he had long put off. Each task was a way to fill the time, to calm the gentle ache of waiting. He spoke aloud to Helen sometimes, telling her their boy was coming home, that things would feel alive again for a while. It wasn't loneliness that haunted Abraham. It was the long silence between what had been and what was yet to come. The town carried on as usual. Kids rode their bikes past his yard. The same truck rumbled down the road every evening. The grocery clerk offered the same half-hearted smile. But beneath the surface, something began to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A patrol car that lingered too long at the end of the street. A stranger's stare that lasted a few seconds too long. Abraham noticed, but said nothing. He had seen too much in his life to mistake unease for coincidence. Still, he hoped it was nothing. Just small-town paranoia, the kind that comes and goes like summer storms. But it wasn't nothing. Beneath the dusty calm of that little southern town, something mean and bitter was beginning to stir. Old prejudices, never buried deep, began to rise like smoke from an unseen fire. Whispers floated through the air, about who belonged and who didn't, about people who thought they were better than their station. Abraham, as always, stayed above it. He continued to walk to the store twice a week, always tipping his hat to strangers and never returning a cold glance with anything but calm eyes. Still, there was an edge in the air now, like a note out of tune in a familiar song. Abraham could feel it, though he didn't say it out loud, not even in his letters. He knew the town. He had lived through its seasons of silence and storms. He had survived them all before, but something in his bones told him that this one would be different. He just didn't know how. And somewhere far away, Elias packed his gear for what he hoped would be the last mission he'd take before coming home. He folded a photo of his father into a small leather wallet, the one Helen had sent him years ago, and tucked it close to his chest. He didn't know about the stairs, or the patrol car, or the bitterness simmering beneath the town's still surface. All he knew was that his father was waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Elias wasn't coming home just to visit. He was coming home to stay. Neither of them could have known that the war Elias had spent a lifetime preparing for was waiting, not overseas, but right in Abraham's backyard. It wouldn't come with warning sirens or formal declarations. It would arrive quietly, like a shadow at dusk, sharpened by hatred, cloaked in silence, and aimed directly at the man who had only ever asked to be left in peace. The police presence in the town was like humidity in the summer, heavy, ever-present, and quietly suffocating. Patrol cars rolled past the same 3 intersections with a kind of ritual monotony, lights flicking for no reason, engines idling for far longer than necessary outside small stores and homes that had nothing to do with crime. The people had grown used to it. Some even welcomed it, believing the show of force kept their quiet world safe. But to others, particularly those whose skin marked them as different, the presence didn't bring comfort. It brought pressure. Pressure to walk straighter, speak softer, and keep one's hands visible even when reaching for nothing more than a wallet or a receipt. At the center of it all was Officer Ray Dempsey, a man who seemed carved out of hard angles and harder intentions. He was in his early 40s, with a square jaw that gave him the look of a lawman out of an old western, and eyes that narrowed just a little too often to be purely out of habit. He had once been considered handsome in his youth, though the years had settled into his face as creases of suspicion rather than wisdom. He kept his hair trimmed to military precision and his uniform crisp, but beneath the veneer of professionalism was a man who enjoyed control in ways he rarely admitted aloud. Ray had grown up in the very town he now patrolled. He knew its rhythms, its secrets, its whispered resentments passed down from fathers to sons over backyard fences and long, quiet rides down dirt roads. He was the kind of man who saw the world in terms of who obeyed and who resisted, who belonged and who didn't. His badge gave him the power to enforce those lines, and he used it liberally. The town let him. After all, he never brought trouble to the doorstep of those who approved of him, and those who didn't often knew better than to speak too loud. He developed a reputation early on. He stopped young black men under the familiar excuse of routine checks, asked for IDs without reason, questioned the presence of visitors on streets they'd walked their entire lives. If they answered back or hesitated, his voice would harden, his hand would drift to his belt, and suddenly, the moment became something dangerous. His reports were always clean. Words like non-compliant, suspicious, and belligerent appeared just often enough to justify his actions without raising alarms. The system, built on silence and benefit of the doubt, had never once challenged his version of events. To those who saw him from a distance, Ray was a protector, a local boy who wore the uniform proudly and showed up when called. He knew the names of the church elders, attended the fall festivals, tipped his hat at the general store. But behind his smiles was a man who bristled at the idea of being questioned, who treated every act of self-respect from someone unlike him as a kind of provocation. For him, authority wasn't a responsibility. It was a weapon, and he wielded it with a steady hand and a careful eye. Ray had noticed Abraham Cole. Not because Abraham had ever caused trouble, he hadn't. Not because he was outspoken, he wasn't. But there was something about the old man that unsettled Ray. Abraham walked with a quiet pride, shoulders back, eyes steady, voice calm. He spoke to others with courtesy, moved with dignity, and carried himself as though the world could bruise him but never bend him. And that, more than any action Abraham had taken, was what Ray found offensive. He didn't see humility in Abraham's silence. He saw defiance. He didn't interpret calm as peace but as challenge. It irritated something deep in Ray's core, something bitter and unspoken. The moment Ray found his excuse came one dry afternoon, the kind where heat shimmered off windshields and the cicadas made conversation impossible. Abraham had driven into the grocery store parking lot, the same one he'd visited every week for years. The lines had faded over time, barely visible beneath tire tracks and sun-bleached asphalt. When he stepped out of his truck, he didn't notice the inch or two that strayed past the white stripe. But Ray did. He had been parked under the shade of a tree across the lot, sipping from a fast food cup and scanning for moments like this. He approached slowly, not with urgency, but with the deliberate pace of someone who knew he had the upper hand. Abraham, halfway through adjusting his hat, looked up to see Ray's shadow stretch toward him. There was no greeting, no question, just an accusation, thinly veiled as a routine observation. Ray informed him that he was improperly parked and asked for license and registration. Abraham obliged, though confusion flickered in his eyes. The interaction should have ended there. But it didn't. Ray lingered, questioning Abraham's purpose at the store, noting the time, asking why he hadn't parked properly. Abraham, ever composed, explained he hadn't noticed, offered to move the truck if necessary. But he didn't apologize. And it was that, more than anything, that twisted something behind Ray's eyes. The officer returned the documents with clipped movements and a final reminder to be more aware next time. Abraham nodded, tipped his hat, and walked inside without looking back. He didn't realize that in that moment he had crossed an invisible line. From that day forward, Ray kept a watchful eye. He passed Abraham's house more often, made slow patrols up and down the street, sometimes pulling to a stop for no clear reason before driving off again. Neighbors noticed, but said nothing. Abraham noticed, too. At first he told himself it was coincidence. But the human mind has a way of recognizing patterns, especially when those patterns come wrapped in silence and suspicion. The same patrol car, the same stare, the same subtle threat. Ray didn't see Abraham as a man. He saw a symbol, a figure who, in his own quiet way, refused to kneel. That kind of presence, to someone like Ray, was intolerable. Abraham didn't raise his voice or make scenes. He didn't protest or shout. He simply lived with the quiet certainty of someone who had endured much and expected no favors. And in Ray's mind, that kind of composure was a challenge to his authority. He couldn't articulate it, not even to himself, but the seed had been planted. And each day it grew in the darkness of his mind, fed by resentment and the false belief that dignity in others diminished his own power. Others might have seen Abraham as harmless, a man past his prime, tending flowers and sipping coffee. But Ray saw what he wanted to see. He saw defiance in every step, rebellion in every calm word. The absence of fear felt to him like an insult. And like all men who feared losing control, Ray began looking for cracks to widen, rules to twist, moments to exploit. Not because Abraham posed any danger, but because he didn't play the part Ray expected. And in this town, that was enough. It began with small things. A warning issued for a non-existent taillight problem. A note left on the mailbox about trash being left out too early. Ray was careful, methodical. Never enough to spark alarm, but just enough to remind Abraham that eyes were watching. Each act, each petty intrusion, was designed not to punish, but to unsettle. To erode the sense of safety Abraham had built in his own home. A slow drip of malice masquerading as law. Abraham responded the only way he knew how, by carrying on. He watered the garden, fixed the front gate, wrote his son with steady hands. He didn't share the full extent of what was happening, choosing instead to spare Elias the weight of worry while he was still so far from home. But in the quiet of evening, as the sun dipped low and the patrol car rolled by once again, Abraham felt the shift. The same ground he'd walked for decades now felt different beneath his feet. And Ray, sitting behind the wheel, watching from behind sunglasses that masked nothing, tightened his grip on the steering wheel just a little more each time he passed. Because in his mind, the story wasn't finished. It was only beginning. Days passed in the southern town where silence often masked hostility, and with each turn of the clock, the quiet siege on Abraham Cole's peace became harder to ignore. The harassment didn't come like a storm. It arrived like a slow, steady leak, subtle, calculated, and carefully veiled in the ordinary workings of law. Ray Dempsey never needed to shout or threaten. His presence alone was enough to set the tone. He knew the town. He knew its quiet lanes and unlit corners. More importantly, he knew how to make a man feel surrounded without ever laying a hand on him. That kind of pressure didn't need bruises. It worked through repetition, through the slow erosion of comfort and routine. Abraham first noticed the warning stickers one morning as he stepped out to make his weekly drive to the feed store. His truck was parked neatly in front of his home, as always, yet a bright orange sticker had been slapped onto the side window. It accused him of parking violations, too close to a fire hydrant that hadn't seen active service in decades. Abraham peeled it off quietly, sighing as he traced the spot with his thumb. He remembered seeing Ray's cruiser passing by late the previous night, its headlights dimmed, the engine whispering along the gravel shoulder. There was no one to call about it, no office that would take the complaint seriously. It would be written off as a clerical mistake or a misunderstanding. So he let it go, at least on the surface. But the interruptions grew more invasive. Midway through the week, 2 men from animal control showed up at his door. One knocked while the other stood behind, hand resting casually on the leash looped at his belt. They'd received a call, they claimed, about a dangerous dog on the property, something aggressive, possibly a pit bull, reportedly seen snarling through the fence. Abraham, too stunned at first to respond, simply blinked and then opened the gate for them. The only living creature in his yard was a gray cat that occasionally wandered over from a neighbor's porch. The men checked the property with a half-hearted glance, exchanged looks, and apologized before leaving. They didn't explain who made the call. Abraham didn't ask. He already knew. A few days later, a county worker knocked on his door regarding a report of hazardous waste in his trash bins. Apparently, someone had seen him disposing of unknown materials. The man was polite, almost embarrassed, and barely lifted the lids before declaring the complaint unfounded. Abraham nodded without smiling, thanked him for coming, and watched from behind the screen door as the county truck pulled away. Later that night, as he emptied his bin once more, he noticed fresh scuff marks on the alley wall near his fence. Someone had stood there recently, maybe watching, maybe waiting. The weight of it all settled slowly on Abraham's shoulders. He had lived a long life, endured decades of quiet indignities, but there was something different about this pattern. It wasn't just annoyance, it was encroachment. It was a deliberate peeling back of his safety, layer by layer. The fear wasn't loud. It whispered, curled around the edges of his days like mist. He began locking the doors earlier, turning out the lights a little sooner, drawing the curtains at dusk even though he loved the way the sunset lit up the living room walls. The sound of tires crunching on gravel now brought him to the window more often. his breath held in his throat until the car passed. Despite the tightening noose around his routines, Abraham never carried himself like a man defeated. He still rose with the sun, still watered Helen's garden with the same gentleness, still greeted the mailman with a nod and fixed broken porch steps without complaint. But those closest to him, though few they were, could sense the change. There was something in his walk now, a caution he didn't used to have. His eyes, though still steady, lingered longer on the horizon, as if measuring how close the storm might be. Unaware of the slow siege building around his father, Elias Cole moved through the final days of his overseas assignment with practiced discipline. He had long since learned to compartmentalize. Each mission, each casualty, each moment of chaos sealed off behind mental doors he only dared to open in solitude. But lately, those thoughts of home had grown louder. Not just the place, but the man waiting in it. He had written a letter that morning before drills, short, like most of his notes, but thoughtful. It spoke of memories shared, promises to return, and the simple desire to sit on the porch again with a cup of strong coffee and no noise but the wind through the trees. He folded it carefully, intending to hand it to Abraham in person. The thought brought a flicker of warmth to his otherwise hardened face. Back in the quiet heart of town, that letter now rested beside Abraham's bed, tucked beneath a stack of old envelopes and paperback novels. He read it every night before sleep, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't forgotten, that something stronger than fear still tied him to the world beyond the fence line. But the calm it gave him during the quiet hours was starting to fray. Shadows moved differently now. The night had a heaviness it didn't carry before. One evening, as Abraham returned home from a brief visit to the market, he noticed Ray's patrol car trailing him. It kept a steady pace, far enough to claim coincidence, but close enough to cast a chill. Abraham didn't speed. He didn't turn unnecessarily. He simply drove the way he always had, hands at 10 and 2, eyes ahead, back straight. When he turned onto his street and slowed to pull into his driveway, the cruiser followed. The flashing red and blue lights came on a moment later, a familiar command dressed in legality. Ray stepped out with deliberate slowness, radio clipped to his chest, one hand resting on the side of his belt. He mentioned a broken taillight, though Abraham had checked them that morning. His voice carried that same clipped authority, the kind that left no room for questions, even when the answers didn't make sense. Abraham asked for clarification, calm, but firm. His gaze didn't waver. That's when it happened. Just for a breath, Ray's mask slipped. The rehearsed detachment cracked, and something raw looked back at Abraham, something bitter and bruised by years of resentment. There was no citation issued, no real justification. After a few tense minutes, Ray returned to his car and drove away, leaving nothing behind but silence and exhaust. But the message was clear. This wasn't about a taillight. It wasn't about laws. It was about control. About reminding a man who dared to hold on to his dignity that he was being watched, that even peace could be revoked if someone powerful enough decided he didn't deserve it. Inside the house, Abraham sat in the dark for a long while, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock louder than usual. He reached for Elias's letter, unfolded it with trembling fingers, and read the words again, slower this time. They felt like a tether, something strong to hold on to as the world around him shifted. But even they couldn't stop the thoughts creeping in. He wondered if the next knock would come at night, if the next excuse would be more than a warning. He didn't know. And that uncertainty, more than anything else, was what made the silence between visits unbearable. As for Ray, he drove through town with one hand resting against the steering wheel, jaw clenched, his mind replaying the moment Abraham had looked him in the eyes without flinching. That look, calm, unmoved, stayed with him longer than he expected. It gnawed at him, curled under his skin like a splinter. He had expected submission. He had expected fear. What he got instead was the unshakable truth of a man who refused to bow. And for someone like Ray, who saw obedience as the only currency that mattered, that refusal was more than an insult. It was a threat, one he now felt compelled to answer. As spring crept into the town, it brought more than blooming dogwoods and shifting winds. It stirred something heavier, something knotted deep in the marrow of the place. The air had changed. Not just with temperature, but in tone. It was as if the town itself had grown suspicious of its own silence. Sidewalks that once echoed with idle chatter became quieter. The regulars at the diner spoke more softly, glancing over their shoulders before exchanging words that used to come freely. The hum of unrest pulsed beneath the routines, rarely spoken of, but felt in the way people avoided eye contact or crossed the street without reason. Abraham Cole felt it with every step he took, every glance that lasted a second too long, every conversation that ended just before it began. The shift in his neighbor's behavior was gradual, but unmistakable. There had always been a polite distance between Abraham and most folks, cordial greetings, vague smiles, but now even those started to slip away. The mailman, who once waved from his truck, now simply placed the letters without looking up. A woman who used to bring him baked bread every spring passed him on the road without a word. The gardener from 2 houses down, who occasionally borrowed his tools, now turned away whenever their paths crossed. It wasn't hatred, not openly. It was the coldness of self-preservation, the kind that grows in people when they sense trouble they don't want to share. Rumors began to slither between porches and church pews, reappearing in casual remarks and whispered warnings. They were the same tired suspicions that had echoed through generations in towns like this, coded language wrapped in concern. Someone mentioned that Abraham had military contacts. Another claimed they saw strange men visiting him at night. Someone else insisted he'd once been arrested in another state, though no records existed. None of it was true, and no one seemed interested in proof. In towns where perception held more weight than truth, all that mattered was repetition. The more the word spread, the more real they felt. Ray Dempsey was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. Now, with the town's silence mistaken for support, he grew bolder. His surveillance of Abraham no longer carried the cloak of professionalism. He stopped pretending. One morning, Abraham noticed his mailbox cracked open, just slightly. At first, he dismissed it, assuming the latch had failed, but the pattern repeated. On 2 more mornings, he caught the box half-latched, the mail disturbed. When he passed the police station on foot, Ray stepped out just as Abraham reached the sidewalk. He smiled, slow and crooked, and asked if the old man had received any important letters lately. There was no reason to say it. It was simply a game to him, a reminder that rules only mattered to those who couldn't bend them. Another day, Abraham made his way to the post office to send a letter to Elias, though part of him doubted it would reach him untouched. As he stepped inside the narrow brick building, he felt a pair of eyes on him. When he left moments later, Ray was parked across the street in his cruiser, reclining in the driver's seat, arms crossed. Abraham ignored the stare, but the weight of it pressed into his back like a brand. As he walked down the steps, Ray pulled his sunglasses down and muttered something through the window. Abraham didn't respond. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the message. They were no longer playing at boundaries. That evening, the clouds gathered thick and low, bringing with them the kind of storm that blurred lines and soaked through roofs. Thunder rattled windows as Abraham slipped on his coat and stepped out into the wind. He needed medicine, simple pills for his arthritis, and the corner store was only a few blocks away. He moved carefully over the wet sidewalk, cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete, rainwater trailing from his hat brim. The store was quiet, the clerk polite but distant. Abraham paid in cash, tucked the paper bag under his arm, and stepped back into the storm. The sky had darkened further by the time he neared his street, and with it came a chill he couldn't blame on weather alone. There, beneath the swaying street lamp, stood Ray Dempsey. His uniform was soaked, clinging to his frame, mud caked along the edge of his boots. He leaned against the side of his cruiser, arms folded, waiting without pretense. There was no call, no reported crime, just him, standing like a shadow with a badge. The rain beat down around them, water splashing in the gutters, but neither man moved at first. Abraham met his eyes with the same quiet resolve he'd carried for years, though tonight it felt heavier to wear. Ray stepped forward, his boots sloshing through a shallow puddle. His words, though muffled by the rain, dripped with the same bitter venom he'd failed to hide before. He questioned Abraham's errand, implied suspicions, spoke of unsettled things in the town. Abraham, drenched but unwavering, replied evenly. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to justify his every movement to a man playing God in a small town. The exchange lasted only minutes, but the weight of it pressed on the air like a held breath. Then came the moment Abraham would remember long after the storm passed. Ray's hand, still resting near his belt, didn't move, but it lingered. The fingers hovered near the holster just long enough for the message to land. No words could have said it more clearly. Ray didn't just want to intimidate. He wanted Abraham to flinch, to fear, to surrender. But again, Abraham stood tall, turned without a word, and walked home through the rain. His pace didn't quicken. He didn't look back. But the chill that traveled down his spine that night came from more than the cold. Inside, he dried his coat in silence, medicine still unopened on the kitchen counter. The lights flickered with the passing storm, and thunder shook the windows like a distant roar. He stared at the door, then at the hallway where the bedroom light glowed faintly. That letter from Elias was still there, resting beside the lamp, untouched since the last time he read it. He moved to the chair beside it, took the paper gently in hand, and read it again, each word grounding him, reminding him that somewhere beyond this town there was someone who still saw him, not as a problem, not as a threat, but as a father, as a man. In the street below, the storm rolled on. Ray had driven off into the night, but the lines he crossed stayed behind like footprints in wet soil. The distinction between law and vendetta was gone, blurred beyond recognition. And Abraham, though he kept his silence, understood what that meant. This was no longer about broken taillights or mailbox snooping. The game was over. The danger was real now, not just implied. And the rain, steady and unrelenting, became a drumbeat in the dark, a warning of what was to come. On the edge of town, under a sky that pressed down like a held breath, the heat wrapped around everything with the weight of an invisible hand. The sun glared white and fierce, burning into cracked sidewalks and rusted porch rails, drawing sweat from every surface it touched. Abraham Cole stood beneath its gaze, sleeves rolled, shoulders tense as he hammered in a crooked nail along his backyard fence. The boards had warped during the last storm, and though his ribs still ached from the damp chill of those nights, he worked slowly, methodically. His hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with the quiet patience of a man who had never expected ease from life, only dignity. Sweat beaded along his brow, dripping down the curve of his cheek, but he did not stop. There was peace in the rhythm. There was order in fixing what had come undone. The radio inside hummed softly, some old blues tune drifting through the kitchen window, and for a moment, time felt still. But that stillness, like all things in this town lately, was fragile. It didn't last. The distant crunch of tires over gravel stirred the silence like a stone cast into a calm pond. Abraham straightened, slow and wary, turning his head just enough to see the familiar silhouette of a police cruiser creeping up the road. It rolled to a stop just outside the gate, engine humming like a waiting beast. The door swung open with a practiced motion, and out stepped Officer Ray Dempsey, posture relaxed but expression tight, like someone restraining barely controlled aggression behind the veil of authority. Ray's presence was like a shadow cast long before the sun could justify it. He stood with hands on his hips, the holster at his side catching the light, eyes already scanning Abraham like a mark on a checklist. He claimed, voice heavy with implication, that someone had reported suspicious activity near the property. No one had called. There were no bystanders, no curious neighbors peeking from behind curtains. Just Ray, standing there, alone and unchallenged, performing a routine of power that needed no witnesses to feel real. Abraham, worn and wary, wiped his hands on an old cloth tucked into his waistband. He asked what kind of activity, what warranted yet another uninvited visit. But Ray wasn't there for answers. The air thickened as the silence stretched, filled only by the buzzing of insects and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Ray took a step forward, his boots crushing dry grass beneath them, and began a slow circle near the fence as if inspecting something unseen. His words came sharp, wrapped in false concern, accusations of obstruction, warnings about interfering with law enforcement. Abraham's face remained still, but inside his chest, something cracked just slightly, not from fear but exhaustion. This was no misunderstanding. It never had been. This was performance turned punishment, an old ritual replaying with new cruelty. He turned away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that dignity alone would never be enough to stop a man like Ray. As he moved toward the porch steps, intent on returning inside, Ray closed the distance in a few swift strides, his hand clamped down on Abraham's arm. Not hard at first, but firm, deliberate. Abraham's body jolted at the sudden contact. Startled, he pulled back instinctively, not with force, but with the reflex of someone trying to regain personal space stolen without cause. And that was all it took. Ray's grip tightened in an instant, and with a sudden shove, he sent the old man backward. Abraham's feet caught the edge of the lowest step. He stumbled, then fell hard against the wood, the corner of a step jabbing sharply into his side. A sharp crack echoed in his ribs, followed by a sickening wave of pain that stole the air from his lungs. His cane clattered to the side, forgotten. The sky, wide and bright above, seemed to dim as pain overtook him. Abraham gasped, hand clutching his side, vision swimming. Ray crouched beside him, not to help, but to loom. His shadow stretched over Abraham's chest as he leaned in, his face twisted into a smirk. He spoke low and slow, the words more chilling than the shove that had come before. He reminded Abraham, in no uncertain terms, that age didn't place anyone above the law. Then, without so much as a backward glance, he straightened, stepped off the porch, and walked to his cruiser. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone. No ambulance was called, no report filed. No one came to check if the old man could stand. Abraham lay there for a long moment, every breath an ache, every shift a struggle. The sun still bore down mercilessly, but now it felt 1,000 miles away. He stared up at the roofline of his porch, eyes squinting through the pain, until finally he reached for the step rail. His fingers curled slowly around it, pulling inch by inch. The world spun, blurred at the edges, but he didn't cry out. He never did. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself up one rung at a time, a low groan escaping only when the pressure on his side grew too sharp to bear. He made it to the door, hand fumbling for the knob. It opened with a creak, and he collapsed just inside, onto the worn wooden floor that had once been polished by the laughter of his late wife. The house felt too quiet. The radio had clicked off long ago. He rested there, chest heaving, sweat mingling with the dirt on his face, and listened to the sound of his own breath. Slow, shallow, painful. The bruises would rise quickly. The rib, maybe two, was broken. But it was the humiliation, the violation, that bruised deeper. A man like Ray didn't shove people for justice. He did it to see them fall, to mark his dominance, to remind them of where they stood. Abraham stared at the ceiling and wondered if anyone had seen. But of course, even if they had, no one would come forward. The silence of this town was louder than any scream. The minutes stretched into an hour before he pulled himself up again. He moved toward the kitchen, one step at a time, each motion a battle against his body. He reached the table, lowering himself slowly into a chair as if gravity itself had grown crueler. The letter from Elias was still there, still folded neatly where he'd left it the night before. He reached for it with trembling fingers and opened it again. Reading the words didn't lessen the pain, but it grounded him. Elias was coming, not in weeks, but in days now. There was still time, still hope. His son, the man shaped by war and duty, was out there, alive, strong, and unaware. Abraham let the paper rest against his chest, his breath catching once more. He couldn't hide this, not anymore. But he also wouldn't call for help. That, too, was a form of surrender. No, he would wait. He would endure. And when Elias arrived, when he saw the truth with his own eyes, there would be no more pretending, no more silence. Whatever storm was coming, Abraham knew he could not stop it. He could only brace for its arrival. And in the stifling heat of that Friday afternoon, with his ribs splintered and his dignity bruised but intact, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. Ray Dempsey had crossed a line, and this time someone would answer for it. Under a fading orange sky, the quiet of the neighborhood had grown thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The last warmth of the day clung to the wooden planks of Abraham's porch, where he sat in silence, back straight despite the pain stitched through his side. His ribs still ached. The bruising darkened into an angry shadow across his chest, but his expression held firm. His face bore the swelling and cuts from Ray's earlier assault, yet there was no collapse in him, no defeat. A patched flannel shirt covered the fresh bandages beneath, and his cane rested against the porch railing within reach. Every movement was measured, every breath deliberate. He sat not in comfort, but in defiance, watching the world through eyes that refused to lower. The sun had slipped just below the treetops, turning the houses into silhouettes. Porch lights flicked on one by one, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. Inside homes, televisions flickered and stoves simmered with evening meals. Yet Abraham's home remained dim. He had chosen the quiet over distraction, needing to sit with the stillness of his thoughts. He thought about Elias, somewhere in transit now, perhaps already touching American soil. He thought about the letter, folded in his coat pocket, read so many times the creases were beginning to tear. A part of him hoped his son wouldn't see him like this, not yet. Not until he could straighten his spine without flinching. But time had never worked in Abraham's favor, and tonight it would betray him again. A sound broke through the crickets and rustling leaves, the low hum of an engine. Abraham lifted his eyes toward the road, already tensing. The car wasn't marked. A dull, gray sedan rolled to a stop just beyond his fence. The driver's door opened slowly, and a figure stepped out. It was Ray Dempsey. No badge, no radio, no illusion of protocol. He wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, a cap pulled low over his brow. But there was no mistaking the shape of him. The broad frame, the tight jaw, the eyes that held no warmth. Abraham's fingers curled around the edge of his chair. There was something wrong in Ray's posture. Something final. He wasn't here for questions. He was here for something darker. Ray didn't call out. He didn't bother with words. He walked with slow, sure steps up the yard, one hand swinging loosely at his side, the other gripping a red canister. Abraham didn't move at first, trying to believe he'd misread it. But the fumes reached him before the man did, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. Gasoline. Abraham pushed himself to his feet, breath catching in his throat. His body screamed in protest, the broken rib reminding him of his limits. Still, he stood. Still, he faced him. Ray reached the edge of the porch without a word, lifted the can, and let it pour. The liquid splashed across the wooden boards, darkening the grain in wide streaks. It splattered Abraham's shoes, then soaked up along the fabric of his pants. Cold and oily, it clung to him like an accusation. He stepped back instinctively, too slow, too pained to react with any speed. His eyes searched Ray's face for some hint of hesitation, some flicker of restraint. There was none. Only that same smirk stretched wide, this time unfiltered by uniform. Ray struck a match against the side of the can, watching the flame flare to life like it was something holy. And then, as casually as if lighting a cigarette, he dropped it at Abraham's feet. The fire caught instantly, a burst of orange and gold that whooshed across the boards, dancing up Abraham's legs in seconds. The pain was immediate and indescribable, an eruption of heat that devoured skin, clothes, and air alike. Abraham screamed, a sound raw and involuntary, drawn from somewhere deep and primal. The fire climbed higher, licking at his chest, searing through the thin layers of flannel and flesh beneath. His hands flailed, trying to swat away the flames, but the gasoline had soaked in too deep. He stumbled backward, then forward, agony blinding him as his face began to burn, the left side catching full force as the fire curled upward. Ray didn't move. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a show. His face bore no urgency, no fear of being caught. He looked satisfied. There was something triumphant in his eyes, as if this was the conclusion he had always intended. The fire reflected in his pupils, making them gleam like glass. It was only when the distant sound of screeching tires echoed down the road, someone witnessing the horror from a passing car, that his stance shifted. The driver, too shocked to stop, kept moving but fumbled for a phone. Ray cursed under his breath, turned, and jogged toward his car. The engine revved, tires spat gravel, and then he was gone, just smoke and silence in his wake. Abraham's body hit the ground with a sickening thud as he tumbled down the porch steps, still partially engulfed. The wet grass met him with a hiss, extinguishing much of the fire but not the pain. He rolled, groaning, the flames dying away as steam rose from his clothes. The smell of burnt fabric and flesh lingered in the air like a curse. He clawed at the earth, lungs heaving, skin blistered and raw. His face was the worst. The left side had melted under the heat, skin bubbled and blackened, the eye swollen shut. His beard, once neatly trimmed, had burned away in patches, leaving scorched skin beneath. His hands bore red welts, and his legs, soaked in gasoline moments earlier, were ravaged from thigh to ankle. The pain had pushed him past consciousness more than once, but each time he faded, something pulled him back. Maybe it was the thought of Elias. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was simply not wanting to die on the same patch of dirt where he'd planted roses for his wife. Sirens, faint at first, grew louder. The flashing red and blue lights came into view just as his vision blurred into darkness. The paramedics descended with practiced urgency, but the shock in their eyes betrayed how bad it truly was. They called in the burns as second degree, with likely third on parts of the face and legs. They loaded him into the ambulance quickly, whispering to each other in clipped tones about how something like this could have happened. At the hospital, a team of doctors worked through the night to stabilize him. His vitals fluctuated. The burns required immediate treatment, cooling, IV fluids, pain management. The skin would scar. The face would never look the same. But Abraham lived, barely. Consciousness drifted in and out like a boat against a rough tide. The staff made notes. Police were notified. But no arrest came, not that night, not the next day. The town buzzed with whispers, but none dared to speak them too loud. The attack was called a house fire in early reports, an unconfirmed accident. Neighbors who had once waved from across the lawn closed their blinds a little tighter. Some claimed they hadn't seen a thing. Some genuinely hadn't. Fear moved faster than truth. And Ray had disappeared for the moment. No statements. No suspension. His name wasn't even mentioned in the local broadcasts. But the damage had been done. Abraham's home still stood, blackened in spots but intact. His body, however, bore the full weight of what had happened. It was no longer a matter of bruises hidden beneath clothing. The cruelty was now carved into his skin, unmistakable, irreversible. In a sterile hospital bed beneath humming lights, Abraham lay still, his breath shallow, his body wrapped in white gauze like a warning. Machines beeped softly beside him, each sound a reminder that he had survived. Barely. But what remained was not just pain. It was fury. And somewhere, not far now, Elias Cole was arriving. Unaware that the father he had planned to visit would meet him not on a porch with open arms, but in a burn ward, broken by the kind of hate that no uniform could disguise. And when he found out what had been done, what had been allowed to happen, the silence that had surrounded it, there would be no restraint. Something in the air was already shifting, as if the fire had sparked more than just flame. It had ignited reckoning. The call came just before dawn, breaking through the quiet haze of Elias Cole's quarters like a blade through cloth. He woke to the vibration of the secured line on his desk, blinking against the harsh red glow of the alarm clock. The voice on the other end was trembling, half swallowed by static and panic. The words were disjointed at first, fragments strung together by desperation. "Your father, there's been an incident, gasoline, severe burns, hospital." Elias stood frozen, barefoot on cold tile, the receiver pressed tightly to his ear. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. His fingers, hardened by years of combat and sharpened by precision, trembled just slightly as the voice kept going, filling in the gaps that would never make sense. The base commander arrived within minutes. Procedures moved quickly after that. Emergency leave was approved without question. A private jet arranged. The Navy did not delay when it came to Elias. He had earned that much. Yet despite the speed of it all, the flight felt infinite. Elias sat alone beneath the low hum of the cabin lights, his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. He didn't replay the words of the call. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Something deeper than thought had already begun unraveling inside him. His jaw clenched tight enough to ache. His heart, though steady, beat slower than usual, as though conserving every drop of focus for what would come next. The hospital loomed gray against the rising sun as the car pulled in. Elias stepped out with movements that seemed too controlled for someone whose world had just been split in half. The automatic doors parted soundlessly, swallowing him into the sterile corridor that smelled of bleach and blood. Nurses turned as he passed. Some recognized the rank. Some saw only the stillness in his posture and moved aside. When he reached the room, a doctor stepped forward, beginning to speak in a careful, measured tone. Elias didn't listen. His eyes were already on the bed, on the man lying still beneath pale sheets, half his face hidden beneath thick gauze. Abraham didn't stir at first. The machines around him blinked and beeped softly, a low rhythm that seemed out of sync with the violence that had brought him there. His exposed skin was blistered and raw, red as ember-cooled coal. His left leg lay elevated, covered in wet bandages that hinted at deeper damage beneath. Elias walked in slowly, standing beside the bed without speaking. His shadow fell over the man who had raised him, not with heavy hands or sharp words, but with quiet strength. Now that same man lay broken by cruelty that wore a familiar face. The face of authority unchecked. Minutes passed before Abraham stirred. His right eye fluttered open, swollen but alert. He saw Elias, and the smallest flicker of relief passed through the corner of his mouth. No words were exchanged. None were needed. What could be said that wouldn't buckle under the weight of what had been done? Elias sat beside him. He didn't touch him, afraid of causing more pain, but his presence settled into the room like gravity. Strong, anchored, immovable. When he finally rose from the chair, hours had passed. He had spoken to the doctors, signed the papers, read through the preliminary police report. It was thin, insultingly so. The file labeled the attack as possible arson pending investigation. There were no suspects named, no arrests made. The deputy who handed it to him didn't meet his eyes. Elias said nothing in return, just turned the pages slowly as if studying an enemy's dossier. Every line of omission etched something colder into him. Every excuse, every delay, added weight to a scale that was already beginning to tip. He filed a formal report through military legal channels. He called in favors. He spoke to local law enforcement again, in person, his voice calm but clipped. The sheriff stammered something about lack of evidence and community tensions. Witnesses had refused to speak. Security footage was mysteriously corrupted. The name Ray Dempsey didn't appear anywhere in the paperwork, despite Abraham's testimony. Elias did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he watched, studied, memorized. Because Elias wasn't just a man in uniform, he was a tactician, a weapon disguised in discipline, and now he had a target. He drove past the house next. The sight of it knocked the breath from his lungs. The porch was charred black. The railing collapsed where the fire had licked up its sides. Yellow tape clung to the doorway like a half-hearted apology. The roses in the front garden were burned down to stubs, their stems curled inward like fists. Elias stepped out of the car and walked slowly through the grass, each step deliberate. He stood before the steps where his father had been pushed. The ashes were gone, but he saw it clearly. The gasoline, the match, the man who had watched it all. Elias turned, scanning the quiet street, seeing not homes but shadows, silent witnesses, complicit silence. Back at the hospital, Abraham slept. The painkillers had dulled his senses, but not the memories. In his dreams, the fire still rose. Elias sat beside him again that night, watching over him like he had once been watched over, but now the roles were reversed, and the boy who once feared the dark had returned a man who had walked through darker things. He didn't cry, he didn't break. He sharpened, quietly, meticulously. In the corners of his mind, maps were forming, roots, patterns, weaknesses. Ray Dempsey had made the mistake of thinking small-town power could shield him from consequence, but Elias had never played by town rules. He knew how systems worked, how they failed. He had seen good men buried by politics, watched monsters slip through cracks shaped like laws, but he also knew something else, fear, and he could wield it, with precision, with purpose. He would not scream into voids or chase signatures on petitions. He would not beg justice from those who had turned their backs. He would bring it, not with vengeance, but with clarity, the kind that did not ask for permission. In the days that followed, Elias returned to the police station once more. He didn't announce his name or his rank this time. He waited until Ray arrived, not in uniform but in plain clothes, laughing about something with another officer. Elias watched from his car, unmoving, until their eyes met through the windshield. Ray faltered for half a second, a flicker of recognition, a pause. Elias smiled, just barely. And in that moment, Ray understood. He had not buried an old man. He had unearthed something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Ray Dempsey felt fear. Elias didn't don his uniform. He didn't make public statements, nor did he stand in front of the media to give speeches about justice. He didn't need to. Instead, he returned to the remnants of his childhood home, now charred and hollowed out, the walls still smelling faintly of smoke and scorched wood. The once familiar creak of the porch had been replaced by silence. He stood there for a moment, surveying the destruction, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The quiet that hung in the air was a canvas, one upon which he would write a story of his own. Elias wasn't here for apologies. He wasn't here for sympathy. His father had been shattered by hate, and Elias was going to use that same hatred, sharpened into something unrecognizable, to cut through the wall of complacency that had shielded the guilty. He started with the people who had been close to the attack, the ones who had watched from their windows or crossed paths with Ray Dempsey on patrol. They had all heard the whispers, the rumors about Abraham, about the mysterious reports of suspicious activity that seemed to follow him for weeks, if not months, before the attack. But until Elias showed up, there was no reason to speak. Now, under the weight of his presence, the community had no choice but to face their own cowardice. Elias asked the questions that others were too afraid to ask, his voice soft but cold with a quiet authority that made the air grow still. He did not need to shout. His eyes alone told those he questioned that he had seen things, done things, far darker than they could imagine. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to unravel. The pattern emerged quickly. The harassment, the fake reports to animal control, the unprovoked traffic stops, the constant intrusion into Abraham's private life. Elias tracked the steps as if they were footprints in the sand, each one leading him closer to the source. He pieced together every scrap of evidence he could find: surveillance camera logs from the grocery store, voice recordings that had been overlooked by a system too incompetent or apathetic to act, even statements from those who had been too afraid to speak before. But now they did, and the more Elias listened, the more familiar the name became. Ray Dempsey, the man who had set the fire, but not the one who had started the blaze of hatred that led to it. That was a fire that had been kindled long before that night, in small, insidious ways. And Ray had done it all without realizing that the very thing he sought to destroy would one day rise from the ashes stronger than he could ever imagine. For Ray, the weeks that followed were not kind. His usual bravado, the swagger with which he patrolled the streets, began to fade. Whispers followed him too, but they were not the same as before. They were about a man asking questions, about a man who had returned from the dead, or at least from a war that had changed him. Elias Cole's name began to float in the air like smoke. Ray had no idea of the connection at first, just that someone was looking too closely at the way things were done, and that unsettled him. His patrols grew shorter, his rounds less frequent. His nights were plagued by restless dreams, where his uniform was stripped away and he was exposed to the eyes of those who had watched and listened. He didn't know when it had started, but the pressure, the feeling of being watched, had begun to settle into his bones. But even in his unease, Ray didn't change. He didn't act like someone who had done something unforgivable. Instead, he retreated further into his own smug silence, justifying his actions in the dark corners of his mind where only he had the courage to speak. He hadn't been the one to pull the trigger, after all. He hadn't even touched Abraham after the fire. He had been careful. He had been smart. But the unease wouldn't leave him. Ray knew something was coming. He just didn't know when or how. Elias, however, was not here to make Ray feel uneasy. He wasn't concerned with making threats or issuing warnings. He had done that before. He had done it in foreign lands where the rules were different, where life was cheap and death was a constant companion. This was something different, something more personal. Ray had broken something in Elias, something he had once sworn never to let anyone touch. He had taken the last thing Elias had, the one person who had always believed in him, no matter how broken, no matter how flawed. And for that, there would be no mercy. The cold calculation of Elias's mind never faltered. He didn't rush. He didn't act on impulse. He was methodical, precise, like a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every step Elias took was measured, every question asked, every piece of evidence gathered with care. Ray's name came up again, and with each mention, Elias felt the weight of the truth settle deeper into his chest. It wasn't just about the fire. It wasn't even just about what had been done to his father. This was about accountability, about paying the price for all the little things, those quiet cruelties, those whispered prejudices that had festered under the surface of this town. Elias knew that if Ray was allowed to continue, others would suffer. Others would be destroyed the same way his father had been. Elias couldn't let that happen. So he continued to ask questions, digging deeper into the life of the man who had destroyed his family. He didn't waste time or energy on threats. He didn't need to say much. Elias knew exactly how to make Ray uncomfortable, how to make him feel exposed without saying a word. He could see it in Ray's eyes every time their paths crossed, the flicker of recognition, the hesitation. Elias wasn't just some officer returning from overseas. He was something else now. He had become a force of nature, a thing that didn't need to announce its arrival. Ray felt the weight of it every time Elias was near. It was the kind of presence that made men turn their backs, that made them feel the quiet judgment of someone who had seen too much and now demanded accountability. Elias didn't need to confront Ray head-on. Not yet. His time would come. But for now, he was a shadow in the town, moving through the cracks, collecting the pieces of Ray's unraveling world. With each piece, Elias moved closer to the man who had broken his father. The closer he got, the more the air around Ray thickened. He was starting to realize slowly but surely that this wasn't just a man asking questions. This was something much worse, a reckoning. And it was coming for him. Night fell over the town like a heavy curtain, its darkness folding in on itself, creating shadows that stretched long and deep over familiar streets. But this was not a night for spectacle. No sirens screamed into the still air, no blinding lights illuminated the path to justice. Instead, it was a night of quiet reckoning, a confrontation made not for an audience, but for one singular purpose, to hold someone accountable, the kind of justice that didn't need fanfare, only action. Elias knew the place well, a remote clearing near the county line, a space where officers had learned to retreat when the hours slipped into darkness. It was here that the rules of the uniform didn't matter, where camaraderie had long since abandoned the moral compass, replaced by whispers of indulgence. Ray Dempsey had his hands wrapped around that tradition, pulling from it when his own failures were too loud to ignore. Elias tracked him down with careful, deliberate steps, feeling the cool night air wrap around his body like the tension he had carried for weeks. This wasn't a mission or an operation. This was personal. This was a man confronting the darkness that had festered inside his town, and inside Ray himself, for far too long. Ray stood by his truck, cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers, the smoke curling upward into the moonlit sky like some strange omen. His posture was relaxed, unworried, as if the weight of the world had never quite found its way to his shoulders. He didn't hear Elias's approach, not at first. Not until the sound of boots crunching the dry earth beneath him broke the quiet of the clearing. When Ray looked up for a moment, he didn't recognize the man walking toward him. The darkness obscured Elias's features just enough, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes. But then the light caught Elias's face, and Ray's gaze fell to the scar beneath his left eye, the scar his father had told stories about in fragments, as if those nights were something too painful to recount entirely. Recognition hit Ray like a punch to the gut, but it was too late. His heart raced, but his body froze. Elias didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried weight enough. He stepped closer, the cold determination in his gaze visible even in the low light. There was no need for theatrics, no demand for an explanation. Elias had already prepared himself for what was to come. He would not be intimidated, not by this man, not by any of it. His words cut through the still air, each one like a sharpened knife carving into the silence. He told Ray who he was, his identity clear and unflinching, and in the same breath, he laid out everything Ray had done, everything he had taken from him, from Abraham. How his father, broken and burned, was still fighting for his life, a man in his twilight years, forced to endure pain that was never meant to be his. Ray's first instinct was to laugh it off. It was the same response Elias had expected. That empty bravado, the laughter that covered up the cracks of a man who had already been exposed. He had expected the resistance. He had prepared himself for it. But then the tension shifted. Ray tried to throw out threats, the kind that came from a place of fear, not power. Elias knew it. Ray's words were empty, the threats weak. Elias remained unfazed, watching him with a quiet resolve that grew sharper with every passing second. Ray's face twisted in frustration, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the truth. The next attempt was just as futile. Ray tried to run, perhaps the last shred of his instinct kicking in, the impulse to escape the reckoning that was closing in on him. But it was too late for that. In one fluid motion, Elias reached out and restrained him. It wasn't done in a fit of rage or fury, no. It was precision, training that had been drilled into him over years of discipline, a calculated effort to neutralize the threat without allowing it to escalate further. Ray struggled, thrashing under the weight of Elias's hold. But it didn't matter. Elias didn't need to hurt him. Not yet. He needed Ray to know that there would be no escape, that he had nowhere left to hide. And then, from the pocket of his jacket, Elias pulled out a small voice recorder. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the button, and the night air filled with the voices of Ray and another officer, mocking the very attack that had torn Elias's world apart. Their laughter spilled out, light and casual, as though they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. The conversation was laced with an arrogance that was so raw, so vile, that it seemed to stain the air with every word. Elias's expression remained unchanged as the voices bled into the night, clear as day. He could feel Ray's body stiffen beneath him, the realization dawning slowly, agonizingly, that this was the end. There was no denying it now. Ray was finished. For a long moment, neither man moved. The clearing was silent except for the faint sound of the recorder's playback and the distant hum of insects in the underbrush. Ray's face had turned pale, the mask of indifference shattered, his eyes wide as the weight of his own arrogance came crashing down upon him. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Elias didn't need to hear them. There was nothing left for Ray to say. The evidence was inescapable. The truth was already known. Elias held him there for a moment longer, just long enough for Ray to understand, just long enough for the darkness of his actions to settle into the pit of his stomach. And when Elias finally released him, he did so with a measured calm that left no room for mercy. Ray stumbled back, his hands trembling, eyes frantic. There was nowhere left to run now. Elias had already won. The small recorder clicked off. The silence returned to the clearing, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the kind of silence that followed the end of a storm, the calm after the chaos, where the echoes of a reckoning hung in the air like smoke. Elias turned away without a word, not looking back at the man who had tried to break him and his family. It was done. The truth had been spoken, and the rest, whatever came next, would be Ray's burden to carry. Elias knew one thing for certain as he walked away into the night. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. Ray was arrested within 48 hours, the weight of his actions now crashing down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. Elias's evidence had left little room for doubt. The voice recordings played like a tape of Ray's own undoing, words that once dripped with arrogance now condemning him in the cold light of truth. The witness statements, each carefully documented and corroborated, painted a damning picture of the abuse and corruption that had festered in the town's law enforcement for years. Even the hospital reports, once dismissed as inconsequential, now stood as glaring pieces of a puzzle that Ray had tried so desperately to erase. In a town that had long thrived on silence, the sheriff's office had no choice but to act. The community was no longer content to pretend it hadn't seen the truth. The pressure from the media, once distant, had grown too loud to ignore. The town, which had once hung in the balance between fear and indifference, finally found its voice. Those who had cowered in the shadows of Ray's threats stepped forward. The once whispered rumors of abuse, of cover-ups, of a system that had turned a blind eye for too long, all now came to light. It wasn't just Ray who had been complicit, he was only the first to fall. As the investigations unfolded, the truth revealed a far-reaching network of corruption. People who had once been untouchable now found themselves facing charges, their years of silence and complicity unraveling before them. The town would never be the same, but the past could not be undone, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. Through all of this, Abraham survived. The journey to healing wasn't quick or easy. The physical scars on his face would never fade, reminders of the hell he had endured. But as time passed, the pain, the constant ache of betrayal, of fire, began to dull. The town had tried to break him, had tried to strip away everything that made him human, but it hadn't succeeded. The scars were a testament to his resilience, and in time, they became a part of him, worn like a badge of survival. But it was the quiet moments, the time spent at home with his son, that began to heal him most. Elias's presence, steady and unwavering, was what gave him the strength to keep moving forward. In the months that followed, Elias stayed by his side, never once leaving him alone. It wasn't out of obligation nor for some grand sense of duty. It was simply because that's what family did. They stayed. They rebuilt. Elias never sought recognition for his actions. He turned down interview requests, declined the awards and medals that came flooding in. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't need to be. What mattered was that his father was still here, still alive, still able to stand beside him. That was enough. No applause, no cameras, just two men who had faced the darkest parts of their town and survived. They were stronger for it, and in their silence, they were unbreakable. One afternoon, with the sun shining low in the sky, Elias and Abraham found themselves standing together in front of the porch that had once borne the brunt of Ray's cruelty. Together, they set to work rebuilding it. The boards were new, the nails driven in with care, but it wasn't just the structure they were restoring. They planted new roses in the garden where fire had once scarred the earth. The roses grew in the sunlight, their delicate petals unfurling as if reaching toward the future, pushing away the darkness that had once plagued their lives. The act was simple, almost mundane, but it was everything. It was an affirmation of life, a symbol of endurance and strength. As they worked side by side, there were no words for what had happened, no need for explanations or justifications. They both understood. They had fought, they had suffered, but they had won in the end. And now, as the seasons changed, and life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy, they had each other. That was more than enough. They were no longer just father and son. They were partners, survivors, the bond between them now unbreakable. The town would change, yes, but it would never be enough to erase the past. The pain, the fear, the scars, they would always be there, lurking beneath the surface. But with each passing day, the shadows seemed to grow smaller, less oppressive. The town had found its voice, but it had also found its courage. Those who had once been afraid to speak now walked with their heads held high. The darkness could not last forever. Elias never sought fame. He didn't need it. What he had done was not about recognition. It was about protecting the only person who had ever truly believed in him. His actions had been driven by love, by a desire to make things right. He had given his father something that no one else in that town had ever offered him. Not just justice, but dignity, restored. That was all that mattered. And as Elias stood there, shoulder to shoulder with his father, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had survived the worst. The rest would be easy.